Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Annual Symposium. Thank you for joining us. We have over 300 participants from all over the world in all different kinds of time zones. We appreciate people who might be in the middle of the night or 6 a.m., wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. We're very happy to see you. Because of COVID, we are again, as we did last year, holding our symposium on Zoom. Next year, hopefully it'll be in person in Ashland, Oregon. Of course, that depends how situation is with the virus. Hopefully there'll not be another variant of the virus around trying to pursue us. So otherwise, we'll be in the meeting in Ashland, Oregon next year in person and also on Zoom, because from now on, the conference will be both held hopefully in person and also on Zoom. Please reserve your questions to the end of the session and use chat. You will not be able to answer a question verbally, but you can use your chat function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will answer all your questions then. I am John Hamill, the former president of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. I am thrilled to present our new president, elected just last week at our annual members meeting, Bob Meyers. He has an exciting background, which I want you all to hear, because I think he's the perfect person to hold this position. And last week, his biography was read for the annual members meeting, but now is a worldwide audience. A lot of people you present are not members, so you do not know much about Bob Meyers. So here's a little bio we have about him. A respected journalist at the San Diego Union and the Washington Post, Bob served for 19 years. You heard that right, 19 years as president and chief operating officer of the National Press Foundation. He retired in 2014 with the title of President Emeritus. At the Washington Post, he was part of that paper's Pulitzer Prize-winning Watergate investigation and later served as director of the Harvard Journalism Fellowship for Advanced Studies in Public Health. As a freelance writer, his work has appeared in Newsweek, Rolling Stone, and the Columbia Journalism Review, among others. He is the author of 2 books, one which won the American Medical Writers Association Award for Excellence in Biomedical Writing. A member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Board, he has also edited the popular series, How I Became an Oxfordian. If you know our website, that's a series of how people announce to the world what caused them to become an Oxfordian, what facts they found out that caused them to change their mind. And then as a member of the editorial board, Bob is also participating in the Oxfordian, which is our annual journal, which just came out recently. So if you don't have it, check it out. You can get it at the Amazon. Oxfordian 23. So now Bob Meyers is now the new president of SOF. I think this background is perfect background for the president that we need, because we need more contact with the media. And Bob maybe can open those doors for us. Bob will now introduce himself and let you know what to expect today and tomorrow. We have 3 sessions, 3 different hosts, one from where Bob is in Washington, D.C., one coming from Toronto, one coming from Boston. We have an exciting agenda, and here is Bob.
Thank you, John. I'm delighted to be with you, and thank you very much for that very generous, overly generous introduction. We've got an exciting program for you today and tomorrow afternoon. We've got great scholarship looking at the plays and poems, the history of the Oxfordian movement, a discussion with 2 men who say they have discovered a predecessor to Shakespeare, or as we prefer, Oxford, and we will also have fun seeing some of the winning videos in our Who Wrote Shakespeare video contest. But first, I'd like to tell you how I became an Oxfordian. When I was a freshman in college, I ended up, for various reasons, doing my homework in an empty hotel ballroom in Miami. Just me and a few waiters brushing the crumbs off chairs covered with slick plastic. I was reading A Midsummer Night's Dream for a class. I was completely into the words and their music. I was deeply moved by their beauty and it was an escape from my strange study environment. So when Oberon tells Puck of a little western flower before milk white, now purple with love's wound, I literally slid off my chair. In a way, I've been looking for that flower ever since. I was an authorship skeptic in high school and became an Oxfordian after college. How could an apparently uneducated man from a small town read and write Greek and Latin, French, Spanish, and Italian? How could he know about Italy when he never went there? I joined the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship because it helps me continue my education. We are an all-volunteer organization, but there are costs to cover: research, travel, awards, printing, electricity, etc. We support a website, a peer-reviewed journal, a podcast, and a members newsletter. We publish and commission books, and there is no charge to anyone to attend this conference. So while I have the honor to be the first person who will ask you to donate, I will not be the last. And I do hope you will consider supporting us so we can all successfully find that little western flower, which is in fact the humble but very magical pansy. Now let's start with a terrific video. The late Tom Regnier was an attorney, actor, researcher, president of this fellowship, and Oxfordian of the Year in 2016. Living in Florida, he was often invited to speak to groups there. One of the most popular videos on our YouTube channel is called, "Did Shakespeare Really Write Shakespeare?" Well, let's see it now.
Joe, I'd like to thank you for that introduction, and I'd also like to thank you and Gable Stage for building this beautiful set just for my presentation. Yeah, I want to just say a few words before I start. Now, we will have questions and answers at the end, so please hold your questions till the end. And I want to say something about this subject. It is the sort of thing that can get people rather conflicted with each other. It can lead to fistfights, so we don't want to have any of that here. And just remember that what brings us all together is that we love Shakespeare. We love Shakespeare's works, and even if we might disagree about who actually wrote these plays, we can still be friends, okay? So let's keep that in mind. Now, I want to start with a dedication. I am dedicating this presentation to the memory of Marzi Kaplan. Now, a lot of you knew Marzi Kaplan. She was a wonderful person. She was a Carbonell panelist. And she was my teacher in a course called Law, Language, and Literature at University of Miami School of Law. And when I told her I was interested in pursuing this subject, she thought that was great. She told me to go right ahead. She really encouraged me. And that's interesting because there are teachers that I've heard of. I know people who've gotten very interested in the subject of the authorship question, and they went excitedly to some favorite teacher of theirs and started explaining all about it. And the teacher would just say, "Don't go there. Don't study that. Don't look into it. It's not worth studying." So Marzi was not that way. Marzi had the true academic spirit and said, you've got to explore things, you've got to question things, and you've got to find out the truth for yourself. And also, this is a picture of Marzi with her husband, Doug. Is Doug here tonight? He said he would try to be here, but I guess he wasn't able to make it. But anyway, they were a wonderful couple, and we all miss Marzi a great deal. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got interested in Shakespeare. Now, not the Shakespeare authorship question just yet, but how I got interested in Shakespeare. And it started when I was about 8 or 9 years old. Let me go back to that one. 8 or 9 years old, and I read Charles and Mary Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare. Now, how many of you read that or read it to your children or something? Okay, we've got a few hands here. And these are retellings of the plots of Shakespeare's plays for children, and that was a great introduction for me at that age. I knew when I was 9 years old what a pound of flesh referred to. I knew who Romeo and Juliet were. I even knew who Beatrice and Benedict were. And when I was about 10, I saw a production of The Tempest on TV. Some of you may recognize the actors. On the left is Roddy McDowall. On the right is Lee Remick. If you do recognize them, you're showing your age. And then when I got into high school, I studied Shakespeare. I studied Julius Caesar in the 10th grade and Hamlet in the 12th grade. Now, this is a still picture from Laurence Olivier's film of Hamlet. And this is where Hamlet is uttering that famous line, "I can't tonight, I have a headache." But you didn't know that was from Hamlet, did you? Okay, and when I was 17 years old, I toured Europe, and one of the things I saw was Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon. And when I got to college, I took a full-year course on Shakespeare's plays with a wonderful professor named John Dando. And now I had heard a little bit about something called the authorship question, and in one of these textbooks was the first place that I actually read something about it, and it was by Lewis Wright, who was then the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library in DC. And here's what he said: "It is incredible that anyone should be so naive or ignorant as to doubt the reality of Shakespeare as the author of the plays that bear his name. Yet so much nonsense has been written about other candidates for the plays that it is well to remind readers that no credible evidence that would stand up in a court of law has ever been adduced to prove either that Shakespeare did not write his plays or that anyone else wrote them." Now, I particularly fastened on that line, no credible evidence that would stand up in a court of law that anybody else wrote the plays. And I will come back to that a little bit later in this talk. But when I read that, I said, well, if there's no evidence that anybody else wrote the plays, then what's the discussion about? I mean, if you think somebody else wrote the plays, you'd need some evidence, wouldn't you? And if there's no evidence, then there's probably no story there. So I really didn't think too much about it for a while. A couple of years after college, I was an intern for a couple of years with the New Jersey Shakespeare Festival, now known as the Shakespeare Theater of New Jersey. And I didn't think about the authorship question until a few years later, when I was in an airport and I saw this magazine on a newsstand. It's The Atlantic from October 1991, and it had an article about the authorship question. And well, by that time, you know, I'd read most of Shakespeare's plays, I'd seen lots of productions, I'd acted in several of them. You know, so anything Shakespeare I was interested in. So I bought it and I read it. And it had one person arguing the traditional theory that the man from Stratford wrote the plays, and somebody arguing that somebody else wrote the plays. And that was the first time I actually read somebody's argument that went against the traditional theory. And I didn't entirely buy it. I mean, I didn't really change my mind about who wrote the plays at that point, but I did see why people would question it. And so I kind of left it at that for a while. And then around the year 2000, which was around the time that I was about to enter law school, a friend told me that PBS Frontline was running a documentary that it had shown in the late 1980s, which was called The Shakespeare Mystery. So I taped that and I watched it, and I still wasn't necessarily converted, but I thought it had a lot of food for thought in it, and it had different people on all different viewpoints on this particular subject. One of the things that they brought up in The Shakespeare Mystery was that Mark Twain was a huge skeptic about the traditional theory that the man from Stratford wrote the plays. And he actually wrote a book on it, Is Shakespeare Dead? It was the last book that he wrote. Of course, it doesn't get as much attention today as Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. But I just want to make one point. While I've got this picture up on the screen, notice on the cover of that book it says that it's by Mark Twain. And that means that this must have been written by a man whose name was Mark Twain. And that was his real name, and he was born with that name, and he died with that name. And there's no other possible explanation for why that name would be on that book. So just keep that in mind, all you George Eliot and Lewis Carroll fans out there, as we continue with this inquiry. Now, Mark Twain liked to make a lot of fun of the epitaph that the Stratford man had on his gravesite, which apparently he wrote himself, which goes like this: "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Okay, well, interesting. It's kind of simplistic, both in its form and in its content. And a lot of people find it a little bit difficult to believe that this was written by the same person who wrote, "Aye, but to die, and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot, this sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice." That's from Measure for Measure. Now I want to ask this question. It's going back to something Lewis Wright said that I quoted earlier. Why would anyone believe that William Shakespeare did not write the plays that bear his name? Well, I'm going to answer that question with another question. Do the plays really bear his name? And I'm going to answer that with still another question. What's in a name? Thank you. You can quote me on it. Okay, and let's take a look at the name that was actually printed on the books and the plays that were published in the late 1590s, early 1600s. Spelled Shakespeare the way we see it spelled today most of the time. Quite often it was spelled with a hyphen, and I'll talk about the hyphen a little bit more later. But let's look at the records about the man from Stratford. Well, he was born Shakespeare. There's no E after the K, and that's what it says on his birth record, and it says Shakespeare on his death record. Now, during his lifetime, you'll see it spelled many different ways. Shakespeare, Shakespeare, sometimes with an X, sometimes with a G. But what's odd about this is that even though spelling was very flexible in Elizabethan days, people would often have different spellings of their names. Usually, they would find a consistent way of spelling their own name. And also, it seems a little bit odd that if this man was writing these plays and these books, and they were being published under the name Shakespeare, why didn't he conform the way he spelled his name to what was being published? Now, if that were the only oddity in the authorship question, I probably wouldn't think too much of it. But there's more. Now, I want you to take a look here. These are the 6 accepted signatures of William Shakespeare of Stratford. As you can see, some of them are not very neat. And also, as Jane Cox pointed out, who was a custodian of wills at the Public Records Office in London, it is obvious at a glance that these signatures, with the exception of the last 2, are not the signatures of the same man. Almost every letter is formed a different way in each. Literate men in the 16th and 17th centuries developed personalized signatures much as people do today, and it is unthinkable that Shakespeare did not. Which of the signatures reproduced here is the genuine article is anybody's guess. Now, I think what Jane Cox doesn't say, perhaps somewhat diplomatically, is that maybe none of these is his actual signature. Perhaps he had to have someone sign his name for him. These are all on legal documents, so they may have been signed by law clerks because he had trouble writing his own name. So that is something we need to ask about. And if he had trouble writing his own name, how did he write Hamlet? All right, unless you think that other playwrights of the day had terrible signatures, here are some counterexamples. On the upper left is Anthony Mundy, upper right George Chapman, lower left Thomas Dekker, lower right Michael Drayton. They all have very elegant, distinctive signatures, and also readable, I might add. Now, what documentary evidence do we have about this man Shakespeare, about his life? Actually, we have quite a bit of information. There are about 70 documents from his lifetime about him. They show his baptism, his marriage, the birth of his children, his money-lending activities, some lawsuits that he was involved in, tax records. He was fined for grain hoarding at one point. He was a theater shareholder, and there are a couple of records of his having acted. and he left some bequests in his will to some of his fellow actors. And he died in 1616. None of the documents from his life identifies him as a writer of any kind. From his lifetime, remember. Now let's go back to our friend Lewis Wright of the Folger Library. And remember, he said there was no evidence that anybody else wrote Shakespeare's plays. And he says the facts as he sees them, and one of the facts he says is that he, Shakespeare, had a very good education acquired in the Stratford Grammar School. Well, later I went back to this passage because I was thinking about what Lewis Wright said, that there was no evidence that would stand up in a court of law that anybody else wrote Shakespeare's plays. Well, as it happens, there is no evidence that would stand up in a court of law that this young boy from Stratford ever went to the Stratford Grammar School. Now, apparently they didn't keep records of students' names in those days, but you would think that there would be some extrinsic evidence. Maybe a schoolmate would have written a letter later on and said, oh, you know, I went to school with that William Shakespeare who wrote that play Hamlet that they're showing in London now, or something like that. You'd think there would be some record of it. Somebody would have mentioned it somewhere. There is absolutely no record that he went there of any kind. Well, now you might ask this question, and it's a good question. Isn't there a lack of evidence of a literary career for other Elizabethan writers? I mean, maybe if you start looking into all the other great writers of the Elizabethan age, you'll find that there's no record of their going to school or a record of their being a writer from their lifetime. And this occurred to this woman here, Diana Price, who wrote this book on the left, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, which was first published in 2001. And she, at first, was in defense of the traditional theory about the Stratford man writing the plays. But the more she studied his life, the more she thought, well, where's the literary career? I don't see his engagement in letters, and there are no documents identifying him as a writer from his lifetime. But she thought, well, maybe it's the same for other Elizabethan writers. And so she did a great deal of research on 24 Elizabethan writers in addition to the Stratford man. And she was looking for 10 different types of what she called a literary paper trail. And these are the 10 here. I won't go into all of them, but I'll just touch on a few. Evidence of being paid to write. Handwritten matters concerning literary work. Miscellaneous records referring to the person as a writer. And she tried to find how many of these types of literary paper trail she could find for each of these 24 Elizabethan writers. Now, these are the 24 writers, and what you're going to see next is you're going to see a number after each name, and that number is the number of types of literary paper trail that she found for each of these writers. Now, Ben Jonson is up at the top. He has all 10 types of literary paper trail. His literary career is very well documented. And then you go all the way down to the bottom, John Webster. There are still 3 different types of literary paper trail from his lifetime showing that he was a writer. And then there is Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, for whom there is 0 during his life. Now, you might ask this, what about references to Shakespeare's works by other writers in the 1590s and 1600s? Don't these identify the Stratford man as the author, William Shakespeare? Well, this is what the proponents of the Stratford theory will say. They'll say, well, people referred to Shakespeare in the 1590s after the first work was published in 1593, and so they're referring to the Stratford man. But the trouble is that all the references to Shakespeare that are in existence are references to his works. So it's as if you were reviewing a book of someone named, let's say Joe Blow. And you write a review of his book, and you never met Joe Blow, but you say, oh, Joe Blow, his characterization is very good, and his plot twists are very interesting, and blah, blah, blah. And you're talking about Joe Blow this, Joe Blow that, but you're really talking about the writer and what he wrote. You're not saying that you know anything about the man. And that is the same thing that occurs with any mentions of Shakespeare in the late 1590s and early 1600s. And as Stanley Wells admitted, who was a staunch Stratfordian academic, there's no evidence before 1623 which is when the first folio was published, that identifies the name Shakespeare on the works with Stratford-upon-Avon. So was this a literary man? Well, as I said, there's no evidence of his education at the Stratford Grammar School or anywhere else. No letter exists from him. Now, it seems very odd, since he was going back and forth between London and Stratford, you'd think he'd send a letter home once in a while, if he could write one, but there's no letter that survived from him, if he ever wrote one. No evidence that he ever owned a book. In his will, there's no mention of books or manuscripts. Now, many people in those days, when they wrote their wills, would list the books that they were leaving to people by name, because books were very valuable commodities in those days. So you would actually mention them in your will. Now, in the Stratford man's will, he talks about numerous household items. He mentions a bowl, he mentions a sword, he mentions the second best bed that he left to his wife. But nothing about books or manuscripts, no desks, no bookcases, nothing that suggests he had any kind of literary life. No one in Stratford referred to him as a literary man during his lifetime. His son-in-law, a physician, never mentioned in his detailed diary that his wife's father was a playwright. Now, I think this is very interesting. His son-in-law was John Hall. He was married to Shakespeare's daughter, Susanna. And of course, John Hall could read and write. He had to be a physician. And when he met the poet-playwright Michael Drayton, he was sure to make an entry about that in his diary. But when his father-in-law dies, he just said, "My wife's father died the other day." Nothing about him being a playwright. Seems odd. Now, here is Diana Price's challenge. She says that if writing plays were a crime, there wouldn't be enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that William Shakespeare was guilty. And what I'd like you to take away from this presentation, I don't know if you'll change your mind about who actually wrote the plays, but I think you have to at least open up your mind and admit that there are reasons for doubting the traditional theory. If you look at all the evidence and you decide that the traditional theory is true, that's fine. But I do want people to open up their minds and consider other possibilities and see that people who are suggesting other possibilities are not out of their minds. Now, the next thing we have here is quiz time. I'm a teacher and I do pop quizzes, and this is one. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give a prize for this, and it's going to be Diana Price's book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flash on the screen a line from Shakespeare. And if you think you know what character said that line, what character said the line, it's the character, not the play that I'm asking for, then raise your hand. And if you raise your hand first, I'll call on you, and if you get it right, you get the book, okay? So, I'm not going to read it out loud, I'm just going to flash it on the screen. So everybody ready? Yes, right here.
Juliet?
No. Any other papers? I'm going to read it out loud now. I love you more than word can wield the matter, dearer than eyesight, space, and liberty, beyond what can be valued, rich or rare. Come on, come on. Nope. Raise your hand if you think you know. Yes? No. Oh, come on. I want to give this book away to someone.
Give us a hint.
Yes, right here. No. Anybody else? Right here.
Doesn't read like Shakespeare to me.
It doesn't read like Shakespeare to you? It is, though. Sorry. Nice try. It's not a trick question in that sense. It is a trick question in another sense, though. Okay. All right. Well, let me ask an easier question. Okay. So I'm gonna say part of the title of a play, and I'm gonna leave out the last word. So let's see who can get it. Okay. Hamlet, Prince of
Denmark.
Okay, over there. What? Yeah. What? Yes, you get the book. You're the first one I heard. The fact that he went to law school with me is not. Okay. All right, so let's move on. And oh, by the way, I want to say about this too. It is a little bit tricky because when it starts out, I love you, you think it's going to be a lover speaking to another person, speaking to their lover. This is actually Goneril from King Lear. I didn't hear that.
Sorry, I didn't say that enough.
Oh, okay. All right, well, we'll have a couple more quizzes on the way. So everybody be ready, okay? Yeah, this is Goneril from King Lear. And she's saying it to her father. And actually, the words, I think, are so kind of pompous and pretentious. You've got to realize that she's not really sincere when she says it. So it's different from the way Romeo and Juliet talk to each other. Okay, let's move on. Was this a literary man? Well, Hugh Trevor Roper, a history professor at Oxford, found that Shakespeare's elusiveness was exasperating and almost incredible. After all, he lived in the full daylight of the English Renaissance and the well-documented reigns of Queen Elizabeth and King James I. Now, this is an important point because we know the Elizabethans loved to make documents. There are lots and lots of archives full of documents from the Elizabethan age. Now, of course, probably not everything has survived, but still there is a lot to work with. You would think there would be something about the Stratford man being a writer if it ever existed. And since his death, since Shakespeare's death, has been subjected to the greatest battery of organized research that has ever been directed upon a single person. Now, what Hugh Trevor Roper is talking about there is that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, English scholars descended upon Stratford-upon-Avon and London and points in between and ransacking village archives looking for any scrap of paper that could give them an idea of how this man of humble origins came to write these great plays. And they found a few documents about him. That's one reason we have 70 documents about his life. One of them was one of those signatures that I showed you. But they didn't find anything that you could call a literary paper trail. And as Hugh Trevor Roper goes on to say, and yet the greatest of all Englishmen, after this tremendous inquisition, still remains so close to a mystery that even his identity can still be doubted. Well, okay, if there are all these questions, and if there are all these omissions in the evidence, why do people think that Shakespeare was Shakespeare? And there are a few pieces of evidence, but I'm going to concentrate on what is by far the most important piece of evidence, which is the first folio that was published in 1623. Now, how many of you here saw the first folio exhibition that was at the Frost Museum at FIU in February? Okay, we've got a few people here. Okay, over here. All right. Okay, so a few of us went there and saw it. So let's talk about this. Now, people say that this is the thing that finally connects the works of Shakespeare to the man from Stratford. Well, why is that? Well, there's a prefatory poem in the first folio in which Ben Jonson refers to Shakespeare as the sweet swan of Avon. So obviously, that must refer to Stratford-upon-Avon, right? Well, except not so fast, because there are 5 rivers in England called Avon. Avon is the Saxon word for river. So it doesn't quite pin it down to Stratford-upon-Avon. Also, English scholar Alexander Waugh has demonstrated recently that Avon was the ancient name for Hampton Court. And that is the place where Shakespeare's plays were performed for Queen Elizabeth and for King James I. So calling him the sweet swan of Avon simply could mean that he's the person who wrote the plays that were performed at Hampton Court. Well, now about 3 pages later, there's a mention to thy Stratford monument. Okay, so maybe that ties it up. Maybe that makes you sure that it's about Stratford-upon-Avon. Well, there were at least 10 towns or villages named Stratford in England. And, you know, they didn't have zip codes in those days, so really it must have been pretty tough on the postal service, figuring out which Stratford this letter had to go to. But one of them was a market town near London. So people in London who saw the first folio in 1623 might have thought that it was referring to that market town. But what I think is most important about the first folio, and what is most suspicious about it, is the image that it is trying to create of Shakespeare's knowledge. Now, you're probably familiar with this famous line from Ben Jonson. He says of Shakespeare, "And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek." Well, so he's indicating that this was a man not of great education. He didn't know languages very well. Obviously not somebody with a university education. And then there's another passage that is purportedly by Hemmings and Condell, who were two of Shakespeare's fellow actors. Now, I just want to say as an aside that Shakespeare scholars, going back to the 1700s, have demonstrated pretty convincingly that the two letters in the first folio that are supposedly by Hemmings and Condell were probably ghost-written for them by Ben Jonson. They show Ben Jonson's style, and we don't have any indication that Hemmings and Condell would have had the education to write this. But let's just take it at face value. Supposedly, Hemmings and Condell say of Shakespeare, as he was a happy imitator of nature, he was a most gentle expresser of it. His mind and hand went together, and what he thought, he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. So there's this picture that they're trying to create about Shakespeare, that he's just this humble, naive country boy, didn't have much book learning, just wrote what came into his head and didn't even have to go back and cross it out. It just came out perfect the way he wrote it, just kind of spilled out of him. Well, that's maybe not the way that Shakespeare's works were created, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. But that is the image they're trying to create. Not much education, not a highly learned person, not a lot of book learning, and just kind of wrote with inspiration. That was his tool. Now, Joseph Sobran, the late columnist, wrote a very interesting book on the authorship question, and he talks about what Jonson is saying about Shakespeare in the first folio. Jonson implies that Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek, yet Shakespeare uses nearly 400 classical names in his works and shows familiarity with many Latin authors. In fact, Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, neither of which is included or even mentioned in the folio, are taken directly from classical sources. Neither has ever been accused of erring in the slightest in its treatment of ancient history and myth. And Sobran goes on to say, before Jonson, Shakespeare was known as a supremely urbane poet. Virtually every contemporary tribute praises him as honey-tongued or mellifluous. Meyers himself avers that the muses themselves would speak with Shakespeare's fine-filed phrase if they could speak English. It is in the folio that we see a subtle attempt to wrench Shakespeare's image, to make him not a polished gentleman poet, but a popular actor-playwright, the friend and fellow of the common players, who hardly bothered to revise his work. Now, this idea fits in with something else that Lewis Wright of the Folger Library said, this idea that Shakespeare didn't have much formal education. Lewis Wright said that the facts are that the plays showed no evidence of profound book learning. No evidence of profound book learning. Okay, well, I think that's something that is worth questioning. And you might try this experiment. I've done this at the University of Miami library. But go to a major library and go to the area where they keep the books on Shakespeare. And you will find usually rows and rows of bookshelves about Shakespeare. And there are books there that analyze and criticize and dissect his works. And there will also be many books about Shakespeare's knowledge of particular subjects as evidenced in the plays. Now, I have some experience with this myself. As Joe mentioned to you, I taught a course on Shakespeare and the law at University of Miami School of Law. And we spent a semester studying about 6 or 7 Shakespeare plays and finding legal allusions, legal references, legal plot twists, all kinds of legal things in Shakespeare's plays. You can do a whole semester on this, and this was just 6 or 7 plays. There are other plays we could have worked on also. There are about 50 books written on Shakespeare's knowledge of the law, hundreds of articles. You could not teach a law school course or write a book on Christopher Marlowe's knowledge of law or Ben Jonson's knowledge of law or any other Elizabethan playwright that I know of. They just don't show the knowledge of law that is shown in Shakespeare's works. And Shakespeare understood the law from the big picture viewpoint, and he understood the small technical detail. That's something you don't learn from casual conversation with lawyers. You need formal training to get that discipline. And Shakespeare's knowledge of law is really just the beginning. There are books written by doctors on Shakespeare's knowledge of medicine. A few years ago, I was at a Shakespeare conference and I heard a neurologist give a talk on Shakespeare's knowledge of neurology, as shown in the plays. That's how specific the information gets. And most of the books that he would have read would have been in Greek and Latin and would be very rare books that most people wouldn't have. Also, there have been books written on Shakespeare's knowledge of hunting, falconry, horsemanship, military life, military tactics, military equipment, philosophy, commedia dell'arte, navigation, classical mythology, folklore, biblical lore, plants and animals, agriculture and gardening, music, heraldry, precious stones, Italy, Greek drama, and yes, there are 2 books on Shakespeare's knowledge of typography. This is a person who had a lot of technical knowledge. So this is what I call the Shakespeare conundrum. In order to believe that Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, was Shakespeare, you would have to suppose that the son of illiterate parents, and by the way, his children were illiterate also, for whom there's no evidence that he ever went to school, ever wrote a letter, or ever owned a book, somehow attained a world-class education that included fluency in several languages, a deep understanding of a great many technical subjects, thereby becoming one of the most literate people of the Elizabethan age. In fact, whoever wrote Shakespeare's works had to be one of the most literate people who ever lived. And he gained all this knowledge without leaving a clue as to how he did it. There's nothing in the Stratford man's history, no documentation that suggests he ever had this kind of education. So, well, if Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, or I should say, if Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, then who did? Well, a lot of people have been mentioned. Let's look at this possibility. Could William Shakespeare have been a pen name? Well, that's an interesting thought. Did they use pen names in the Elizabethan age? As a matter of fact, Taylor and Mosher, who wrote a seminal book on anonymous and pseudonymous writings that was published in 1951, said that the 16th and 17th centuries were the golden age of pseudonyms. Almost every writer used a pseudonym at some time or other during his career. Let's take a look at some Elizabethan pseudonyms. Martin Marprelate, that was somebody who wrote on religious topics. Cuthbert Currydave, Tom Telltruth. Notice that they have hyphens in them. Now, these were sometimes spelled without the hyphen, but sometimes the hyphen was a hint that this was a pseudonym. Now, I think these 3 pseudonyms are a little bit different from the pseudonym William Shakespeare, if it was a pseudonym, because I think these are obviously made-up names. You see this on a book, and you're going to know that's not the person's real name. William Shakespeare sounds more like it could be a real person's name, and in fact, we know it was very similar to a real person, William Shakespeare. So, what about this name Shakespeare? Why would somebody use this as a pseudonym? What does it mean? Well, Shakespeare is probably a reference to the goddess Athena, the spear shaker, the goddess of wisdom, philosophy, the arts, poetry, and music. And as you may recall from the legend, she sprang fully armored from the brow of her father Zeus, brandishing a spear. The way we were all born, right? So yeah, if you wanted to write poetry, particularly, and you have to remember the first 2 works published under the name William Shakespeare were long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. So this would be a tribute to the goddess Athena, the goddess of the arts. And what about the name William? Well, this comes from the German Wilhelm, Latin Gulielmus, French Guillaume, and the Old Dutch Gildhelm, which means golden helmet. And as you can see here, the goddess Athena is often depicted wearing a golden helmet. So again, it all goes back to the goddess Athena, the goddess of the arts. So who might have been using this pen name? Well, that's the question. Some people have said it was Sir Francis Bacon. Others have said Christopher Marlowe, William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke. Some people have also suggested Queen Elizabeth. Well, she probably would have had the education, but I don't know if she'd have had the time. And some people say, well, oh, this is all bogus because there's so many different people that have been mentioned as a possible author of Shakespeare's works that it obviously can't be all of them, and so it's just a silly subject to bring up. But actually, I think most of the people that have been mentioned, and particularly these 5 here that I've mentioned, are much more likely to have written the plays than the man from Stratford. I think the best argument for identifying Shakespeare was written by a man named J. Thomas Loney, who wrote a book called Shakespeare Identified that was published in 1920. And by the way, the novelist John Galsworthy said it was the best detective story that he ever read. Now I just want to make a comment about this man's name. Notice it's spelled with 2 O's, so it could be pronounced Looney. My understanding is the family pronounced it Loney. Obviously, you can see why they would. But what's interesting is when this book came out, the people who wanted to criticize this book didn't bother to analyze it and show flaws in the reasoning. Instead, they just said, well, the guy's loony, so it can't be true what he's saying. And of course, any rational adult can recognize that that's not a real argument. So what did Loney do? Well, he made a list. He was a schoolmaster. He taught Shakespeare's plays in school, and he became very familiar with him, and he just could not believe that the Stratford man had written the plays based on many of the reasons that I've talked about so far in this presentation. But from the plays, he made a list of 18 characteristics that he thought the author would have to have. Now, I'm not going to show all of them here, but I'll touch on a few of them. He had to be a mature man of recognized genius, not adequately appreciated in his time, an enthusiast for Italy. Many Shakespeare plays are set in Italy, as you know. Loose and improvident in money matters, conflicted in his attitude toward women. Now that last one probably comes from lines like frailty, thy name is woman, the attitude that the author has toward the dark lady of the sonnets. So Loney was going to go and look for circumstantial evidence that would help him find who was Shakespeare. And he describes circumstantial evidence, and now he was not a lawyer, but for me as a lawyer, I think this is a very astute definition of circumstantial evidence. He says that it's, in practice, the most reliable proof we have. The predominating element in what we call circumstantial evidence is that of coincidences. A few coincidences we may treat as simply interesting. A number of coincidences we regard as remarkable. A vast accumulation of extraordinary coincidences we accept as conclusive proof. It is not upon any point separately, but upon the manner in which all fit in with one another and form a coherent whole that the case rests. Now, I think that's an important point, because you may hear people say in ordinary conversation, oh, that's just circumstantial evidence. And I can tell you this, you can prove most cases in a court of law with only circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence is certainly admissible, and it's the evidence you have more than anything else, usually in a trial. But the thing about it is, if I give you just one piece of circumstantial evidence, you'll just say, well, that doesn't prove anything. And you're right, it doesn't by itself. You have to look at all the evidence together, because circumstantial evidence has a cumulative effect. So you've got to look at everything and see where it leads you. So, well, I guess I should tell you who Loney thought was Shakespeare. You want to hear? Yeah. Okay, good. All right. He believed that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, had all of the 18 characteristics that he was looking for. Nobody else came even close. And as he continued to study this man's life, he found more and more circumstantial evidence, coincidences that tied him to Shakespeare's works. Let me give you some examples. And now I'm going to start with a quotation from a book called The Art of English Poesy that was published in 1589. Now, who wrote The Art of English Poesy? Well, nobody knows. It was published anonymously. There are theories about who wrote it, but I don't think it's been conclusively proved. And this is quite common in the Elizabethan age. Many things, as I mentioned before, were written anonymously or under a pseudonym. So the author of The Art of English Poesy, whoever he or she was, said, "I know very many notable gentlemen in the court that have written commendably and suffered it to be published without their own names to it." Now, suffered means allowed. So that means that some noblemen were publishing things, but they couldn't use their own name, so either they used a pseudonym or they just published it anonymously with no name on it, or maybe they got somebody else to put their name on it, who knows. But there were noblemen in the court who were doing this. The next line explains why, as if it were a discredit for a gentleman to seem learned. Now, you have to realize, it seems kind of odd if you wrote the works of Shakespeare, wouldn't you want to claim that they were yours? Any of us would, I think, but in those days, if you were a nobleman, you did not admit to writing plays and poetry. You could write, say, a work of science or history, a serious work, and publish it under your own name, but poetry was considered frivolous. That was something you did in your spare time, or as they called it, your idle hours. And plays, that was even worse. That was scandalous. The public playhouses were places where there was thievery and prostitution and gambling going on, and a respectable person would not want to be associated with that. So that's among the reasons that a nobleman would not publish something under his own name. Now, there's more in The Art of English Poesy. It says, "There are noblemen who have written excellently well, as it would appear, if their doings could be found out and made public with the rest, of which number is first that noble gentleman, Edward, Earl of Oxford." Now, what we have here is a contemporary document that says that Oxford was a secret writer. This is more of a literary paper trail during his lifetime than we have for the Stratford man. And that's not the only one. There are other mentions. In fact, in 1598, Francis Meyers said that the Earl of Oxford was one of the best writers of comedy. Well, that's really interesting because we don't have any comedies that have come down to us under his name. What happened to them? Here are some other facts about Oxford. We know that in 1578, during a Latin oration in the presence of Queen Elizabeth, Gabriel Harvey said of Oxford, "Votus tela vibrat," which means "thy will Shakespeare's," or as some people would translate it, I'm told, "thy countenance Shakespeare's." But this may be where he got the idea for the name Shakespeare later on. Of course, it was much later than anything was published under the name William Shakespeare. We know that he was a patron of the arts. He loved poetry and drama. He commissioned many books, and 28 books were dedicated to him during his life. Several of his youthful poems do survive. Now, some people look at them and say, well, these are not as good as Shakespeare's works, but of course, they're early poems. And I think that you can see the seeds of Shakespeare's sonnets in them. Of course, the sonnets were written in his maturity. They're much more sophisticated and polished than his early poems. But any writer has got to start writing, and he's got to practice and practice and practice until he gets good. The Earl of Oxford had 2 theater troupes, a men's troupe and a boys' troupe. Now people say, well, a man of the theater wrote these plays. Well, Oxford was a man of the theater. He leased the Blackfriars Theater in the 1580s for his boys' troupe, and this is a theater that later became associated with Shakespeare's plays. He did an extensive tour of Italy, including most of the cities that are featured in Shakespeare's Italian plays. These are just a few coincidences. Here's some more. Ovid's Metamorphoses has long been recognized as a major influence on Shakespeare. There are references of some kind to Ovid's Metamorphoses in almost every Shakespeare play. And it seems pretty clear that Shakespeare knew Ovid's Metamorphoses in the original Latin. And also there was a particular translation, this one right here, translation by Arthur Golding. Now Arthur Golding just happened to be Oxford's uncle. And they were living in the same household at the time that Golding was working on this translation. Speaking of Ovid's Metamorphoses, as I mentioned, the first work published under the name William Shakespeare was a long narrative poem called Venus and Adonis that is based on a story from Ovid's Metamorphoses. What we have here is a painting by the great Venetian painter Titian of the story of Venus and Adonis. And in fact, Titian did several versions of this painting, and they were in various places around Europe. Some were in the possession of the King of Spain. There is one particular version, and I'm going to flash over to it right now. It's a little different because, as you can see, Adonis is wearing a type of hat called a bonnet. I'm just going to go back to the other one. So I can see there's no bonnet, and then here's the one with the bonnet. Now, the only place that you could see this particular version was in Titian's studio in Venice. And in Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, there is a reference to Adonis wearing a bonnet, which would suggest that the author of the poem had seen this painting. Now, we don't have any evidence that the Stratford man ever left England. In fact, there would be evidence if he had left the country. But we know that Oxford spent a great deal of time in Italy, and particularly Venice, which was his headquarters when he was touring Italy. So very likely that as a nobleman, he could have gotten entree to Titian's studio and could have seen this particular painting. Now, on the left here, we have an actor playing Polonius in Hamlet. And it's long been recognized that this character Polonius is a satire on this man, Sir William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, who was Queen Elizabeth's right-hand man, really probably the most powerful man in England during Elizabeth's reign. And Lord Burleigh had his own spy network. Now, you may recall in Hamlet that Polonius sends one of his servants to spy on Polonius' son while he's away at university. Well, this is something that Burleigh did. He sent a servant to spy on his son while he was away at university. And there are many other aspects of the Polonius character that are parallels to Lord Burleigh. So, did Oxford know Lord Burleigh? Well, as a matter of fact, when Oxford was 12, his father died. He became a ward of the Queen because he was a nobleman. He was sent to live in Lord Burleigh's household. So that's where he grew up and reached his majority. And later, he married Burleigh's daughter, Anne Cecil. So Burleigh was his father-in-law. So yes, he knew him. They had a lifelong relationship, and not a very easy one because they were very different personalities. On the left, we have some pirates, and as you may recall, there's a plot twist in Hamlet where Hamlet is captured by pirates who leave him naked on the shore of Denmark. Well, Oxford, when he was crossing the English Channel, was captured by pirates and left naked on the shore of England. Probably just a coincidence. Young men falling out at tennis. That's a line from Hamlet. And this is probably a reference to a famous quarrel that occurred on a tennis court between Oxford and this man, Sir Philip Sidney. Now, Oxford and Sir Philip Sidney were big rivals in a lot of areas. Sir Philip Sidney had been vying for the hand of Anne Cecil before she ended up marrying Oxford, for one thing. They disagreed about poetry and theater and politics. And one day, Sir Philip Sidney and his friends were playing tennis on a tennis court. Oxford comes along and asks if he can join in. And at first, Sidney just doesn't answer him. Not a good move, since Oxford outranked him. And eventually it got into a heated argument, and Oxford went so far as to refer to Sir Philip Sidney as a puppy. So that's how you can tell when a nobleman gets really mad. So now the trouble is, Sir Philip Sidney went to war, he died in war, he was buried a national hero. You couldn't make fun of him openly afterwards. But oh, you could write plays in which you satirize him, couldn't you? And this character, Sir Andrew Aguecheek, in Twelfth Night, is very likely a satire on Sir Philip Sidney, who had pockmarks from the ague, and that's where the name comes from. Of course, Sir Andrew Aguecheek is a fop and a dandy, which Sir Philip Sidney was not, but okay, Oxford wanted to make fun of him, so he did, and there are other characters in Shakespeare's works who were also probably takeoffs on Sir Philip Sidney. On the left here, we have Henry Wriothesley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton. And this is the person to whom the two narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, and The Rape of Lucrece, are expressly dedicated. his name is on the dedication page. It says Henry Risley. Also, many people believe that this is the fair youth in Shakespeare's sonnets, the one to whom most of the sonnets are addressed, and the one to whom, in the first 17 sonnets, Shakespeare is urging the young man to get married. Now, it seems very odd that if the man from Stratford wrote these sonnets, he would be encouraging a nobleman to get married. I mean, why does he care? What's that got to do with him? And actually, it would be rather presumptuous for a commoner to write to a nobleman and tell him it's time for him to get married. Well, what about Oxford? Would he have had a reason for writing sonnets encouraging Southampton to get married? Well, as a matter of fact, around the time the sonnets were probably written, Lord Burleigh was encouraging Southampton to marry Oxford's eldest daughter. So, yes, Oxford would have had a reason. He was encouraging Southampton to become his son-in-law. So there is a good reason that you can understand why Oxford would have written these sonnets to him. It's hard to find a good reason why the man from Stratford would have. Now this line, "The devil can cite scripture for his purpose," is from The Merchant of Venice. And the picture you see here is a book. It's Oxford's Geneva Bible. And this now resides in the Folger Library, complete with many annotations and markings that Oxford made in it. And recently, a scholar named Roger Strittmatter, well, not recently, it was about 15 or 16 years ago, did his PhD dissertation on correlations between biblical references in Shakespeare's works and Oxford's notations in his Geneva Bible. And he found that the more often a biblical passage is referenced in Shakespeare's works, the more likely it is to be something that Oxford underlined or annotated in his Bible. King Lear gave his kingdom to his 3 daughters while he lived. Well, Oxford had also 3 daughters. Of course, that's not really much of a coincidence. Lots of people have 3 daughters. But there is a bit more of a parallel to it than that. Oxford was persuaded, or forced maybe, by Lord Burleigh to put his family estate in trust for the benefit of his 3 daughters while he lived. So something very similar to what happened to King Lear. He knew how to be kicked out of his own kingdom during his own lifetime. Let's talk about the Stratfordians, the people who are for the traditional theory. What do they say to all of these things that I'm saying? Well, I can't go through everything that they said in one evening, but let me just give you some general ideas about how they respond to the things that I'm saying. Ad hominem attacks, okay, name-calling in other words, appeals to authority, we are the experts. Straw man arguments, and I'll give you an example of that in a few minutes. Shakespeare's errors. They say, oh, there's so many errors in Shakespeare that an educated man wouldn't have made. And they say the works are unconnected to his life. Okay? So let's take some examples. Ad hominem attacks. Okay, well, if you don't think that the Stratford man wrote Shakespeare, you may be called a snob, an elitist, certifiably mad, conspiracy theorist, Holocaust denier, crackpot. Well, okay, those are the names you might be called, but let me tell you, if you're a crackpot for not believing in the Stratford theory, then you're in very good company, because I want to show you what I call the Crackpot Hall of Fame. And it starts with somebody I've already mentioned, Mark Twain, doubted the traditional theory, Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry James. I think these people might have known a little bit about the creative process, you know, just possibly. Here's some other crackpots, Charlie Chaplin, Sigmund Freud, Orson Welles. And let's look at some crackpots in the theater world. These people all doubted the Stratford theory. John Gielgud was an Oxfordian. Derek Jacobi, another Oxfordian. Jeremy Irons, a doubter about the traditional theory. Tyrone Guthrie. Mark Rylance, who recently won an Oscar and has won 3 Tony Awards, is a doubter. And here's another Oxfordian, Michael York. And then we have some lawyers here. So let's look at some Supreme Court justices who were crackpot doubters about the traditional theory. There's Harry Blackmun, there's Lewis Powell, Sandra Day O'Connor, the late Justice Scalia. And in the next picture on the right, we have John Paul Stevens, an Oxfordian, and here he is seen standing next to some unidentified crackpot. Okay, so that's the name calling. So that's one of the things they do. Another is appeals to authority, and this is, I think, one of the best examples of it. This is from a book called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. And by the way, there are two books with similar names here, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt and Shakespeare Beyond Doubt with a question mark after it. Okay, so this is one that the Stratfordians wrote saying that there is no doubt about the traditional theory, no doubt. They don't even say beyond reasonable doubt, they say there's no doubt. This is a book that a group of people wrote in response to the other book, and I'm one of the authors of this book, by the way, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt with the question mark after it. So anyway, so from this book, the Stratfordian book, Paul Edmondson, who is with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, says there is the loaded assumption that even though one may lack the necessary knowledge and expertise, it's always acceptable to challenge or contradict a knowledgeable and expert authority. It is not. Got that? They're the experts. Don't challenge them. And don't think for yourself and don't look at the evidence for yourself. Just listen to the experts. Got it? Okay. Straw man arguments. This is my favorite straw man argument. They say that anti-Stratfordians, people like me, believe that a person from a humble background can never become a great writer. No, that's not what we think. There are lots of examples of people from a humble background who became great writers. Christopher Marlowe was a cobbler's son. Ben Jonson was at one time a bricklayer's apprentice. Keats was a poor cockney. Lots of examples of people who became great writers without huge education, without a rich background. But our argument is specific to Shakespeare's works. There is so much technical knowledge that is evident in Shakespeare's works that the person who wrote those works had to have had a first-class education. And if you can't find evidence of the person having the kind of world-class education that you find in Shakespeare, I think then you have to doubt that that person could have actually written the works. That's our real argument. This is somebody distorting our argument into something else. Shakespeare's errors. Well, they say, oh, Shakespeare made this error, and there may be some errors in Shakespeare's works, but usually the critics are coming up with things that are not really errors. This is a quotation by a critic named John Doherty, who wrote a book, and really he had the gall to title this book, The Ignorance of Shakespeare. And he said, there's never been a St. Peter's Church in Verona. Now he's talking about Romeo and Juliet, which mentions a St. Peter's Church several times. He says St. Peter's was as good a name as for a church as any for Shakespeare. So he's basically saying, look, Shakespeare didn't know anything about Italy, he didn't know Verona, he didn't know the names of the churches there, but he just had to come up with a name for a church, so he said St. Peter's. Well, maybe John Doherty doesn't know that St. Peter's in Italian is San Pietro, or maybe he never went to Verona, but there's an Oxfordian researcher named Richard Rowe who actually went to Verona and trod the streets and looked in the archives. And he found that in Verona there are 4 churches named San Pietro. There's San Pietro in Castello, San Pietro in Archivolto, San Pietro Martine, and San Pietro in Carnario. And he also determined that the last one had to be the one that Shakespeare had in mind in Romeo and Juliet, because it was a parish church that had been under the control of the Franciscans in the early 14th century. That was the only one that fit the bill. Works unconnected to the author's life. So now what they're saying, and James Shapiro of my alma mater, Columbia, whom I'm very ashamed of, is going around saying, no, don't look for anything of his life in the works. There's nothing to do with his life in the works. And the reason he's saying that is because the Stratfordians have realized that what the Oxfordians have is Oxford's life is in the works. You know, so the Stratfordians are trying to find the Stratford man's life in the works, and it's really hard. It's really a stretch. There was a biography of the Stratford man written about 10 years ago by Stephen Greenblatt of Harvard, and he tries to tie the Stratford man's life to the works of Shakespeare. And it's really tough. His book starts out with the phrase, "Let us imagine." And there's a lot of imagination in it. I think it actually should have been on the fiction list. But anyway, this is Matt Cubis from the book Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, this one I mentioned, the one that the Stratfordians wrote. And he says, what is the problem with reading biographically? And he tells us what the problem is. He said, the critical assumption that there is an inherent connection between the author and the content of his works. So let's not go around assuming that the author's life has something to do with his works. There's no inherent connection. Anybody here a writer of any kind? Okay, well, I think a lot of writers would be surprised to hear that there's no connection between their life and their works. By the way, I'd like to mention something else about this book, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, the one the Stratfordians wrote to make the argument that there is no doubt about Shakespeare. Prince Philip read this book and became a doubter. He read their book. I wish I could say he read our book and became a doubter, but he read their book and became a doubter. So it shows how effective this is. Let's move on here. Now, I think this is a better explanation of a connection between life. This is the life and the works. This is from Professor Michael Delohoyd, who is an Oxfordian, and he's a professor at Washington State University. He says, if you get Shakespeare wrong, you get literature wrong, and probably you get the very phenomenon of creativity wrong. And I think that that is really the point, because the argument between the Stratfordians and the Oxfordians now is about how these works are created. To the Stratfordians, it was all inspiration. There was almost no sweat involved, no personal involvement. It just all came into his head and he wrote it down. You read Oxford's life, you can see that in these plays, he is dealing with his fears, his disappointments, his triumphs, even expiating his sins. You can see the author's life in the plays. And we think that this is the way most art is created. It comes from the author's soul. And Oxford was pouring his heart and soul into these plays. It was not something that was written dispassionately. Okay, and I just want to show you this quotation from Sigmund Freud. I no longer believe that the actor from Stratford was the author of the works that have been ascribed to him. The man of Stratford seems to have nothing at all to justify his claim, whereas Oxford has almost everything. And I want to thank Joe Adler and Gable Stage for letting me do this. Thank you, Joe.
That was great. I want to share with you my sadness in seeing the video of Tom and recognizing his loss. Next, we're going to hear from John Shahan, the founder, chairman, and CEO of the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition. The SAC developed its Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, now with nearly 5,000 signatories, to show that doubt about the authorship is widespread and worldwide as well. John has been an Oxfordian for 25 years. He has written numerous articles for scholarly journals. He was recognized as Oxfordian of the Year in 2012 for his work countering the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust's attack on our movement. John joins us next. John?
Thank you, Bob. And before you go, Bob, can you tell me if you're hearing me okay?
You're just fine.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you for that introduction. Welcome, Shakespeare authorship skeptics, and especially those of you who may be new to the controversy and haven't yet read and signed the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt about the identity of William Shakespeare. My aim tonight is to get you to read and sign it, and also to ask those who have already signed the Declaration to try to recruit others to join you. First, I should clarify that when I say Shakespeare, I mean the Stratford man. And when I say Shakespeare, I mean the author, whoever he was. Contrary to what Stratfordians would have you believe, The Stratford man's name was not spelled the same way as the author's name and was probably not pronounced the same. Whether Mr. Shakespeare and the author Shakespeare were one and the same person is what the Shakespeare authorship controversy is all about. The SAC is a nonprofit educational charity whose mission is to legitimize the Shakespeare authorship issue by increasing awareness of reasonable doubt about the identity of William Shakespeare. This mission is directly counter to the orthodox claim that it is not a legitimate issue because it is beyond doubt that the plays and poems were written by the Stratford man. The SAC is neutral about the true identity of the author, seeking to unite authorship doubters of all persuasions behind the one thing we all agree on: reasonable doubt about the authorship, meaning there is no reasonable doubt that Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford was the author Shakespeare. The declaration was written to provide a brief yet definitive introduction to the key evidence and arguments on both sides of the issue to make it more readily understandable to the public. It also names 20 famous doubters of the past, people like Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, William and Henry James, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Sigmund Freud, John Galsworthy, and former US Supreme Court Justices Harry A. Blackmun and Lewis F. Powell Jr. Let's look at some of the evidence that led such people to doubt Mr. Shakespeare's authorship. First, many people think Shakespeare claimed to have written the works. No such record exists, nor did any family member or descendant ever say that he had been the author Shakespeare. Nothing shows that there was any family tradition that Mr. Shakespeare had been a playwright. And when he died in 1616, no one seemed to notice. No record, not even a letter, mentions the passing of Shakespeare. This was contrary to the usual practice in which even much lesser writers were publicly mourned. Francis Beaumont, who died the month before Shakespeare, was buried with great ceremony in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Mr. Shakespeare was buried in the Stratford Church beneath a stone slab that had no name on it. So why did anyone ever think he was the author? The case for him as the author rests largely on allusions in the first folio collection of plays, published 7 years after he died. But no documentary evidence from his life confirms their validity. If he were the author, there should be solid evidence from his lifetime. There is none. Absent the first folio, no one would ever have thought that William Shakespeare as the author Shakespeare. There are 4 main reasons why his supporters think he was the author. First, a name similar to his appears on the title pages of many of the poems and plays published during his lifetime. Second, the first folio refers to the author as Sweet Swan of Avon, and it later on refers to Thy Stratford Monument, actually monument, spelled with an I. Third, fellow actors John Hemmings and Henry Condell, whom he remembered in his will, seem to vouch for him in the folio. Fourth, the effigy and inscription on the Stratford Monument suggests that Shakespeare, spelled without a medial E after the K, had been a writer. These 4 reasons would seem to amount to a good case for Mr. Shakespeare, except each of them is problematic. First, it is not clear from the title pages that the name printed on them refers to Mr. Shakespeare. It may have been a pseudonym. The name on the works was virtually always spelled one way, Shakespeare, but it was often hyphenated, Shake-Spear, a rarity at the time, used mainly in pseudonyms. Shakespeare's name was never hyphenated in other contexts specific to him. On his baptismal record, even on his monument, the name was spelled no E after the K, with no E after the K. The same is true of its 3 appearances in his will. In none of these is the name spelled with an E after the K. The first folio is a large, complex topic. For now, suffice to say that other than the 2 brief allusions, it offers no further identifying information, no dates of birth and death, nor names of any family members, nor any revealing episode from his life. Short on individualizing facts, the folio's contributors gave us generalized superlatives that describe the author, not the man. Why, for example, does it never simply say William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon? The first folio doesn't even show his coat of arms, as one would expect in such a publication. That would have identified him clearly. Neither Hemmings nor Condell was a writer and probably did not write the passages attributed to them. Ostensibly the editors of the folio, they were in fact wholly unqualified for the task. If the first folio so brazenly misrepresents their roles, why believe anything else that it says? And why did such lavish praise, as we see in the folio, only appear following 7 years of silence after his death? Yes, today's Stratford Monument effigy depicts a writer, but it is not the same as the original. A sketch made in 1634 shows a man with a drooping mustache holding a wool sack, but no pen, paper, or writing surface as seen today. Records show that the monument was repaired. The effigy evidently was also altered to depict a writer. The monument's strange inscription never says that Mr. Shakespeare was the author Shakespeare. It neither names nor quotes from any of the plays or poems, and it never mentions poetry, plays, acting, or theater. Epitaphs of other writers of the period identify them clearly as writers. Why not Mr. Shakespeare's epitaph? If the evidence for Mr. Shakespeare were otherwise sound, these problems would hardly matter. But once one looks beyond them, one finds no evidence that he was any kind of writer at all. Of a few great writers like Homer, we know nothing at all. But there is only one great writer about whom the more we learn, the less he appears to have been a writer: William Shakespeare. Not one play, not one poem, not one letter in Mr. Shakespeare's own hand has ever been found. The only writings alleged to be in his own hand are 6 shaky, inconsistent signatures on legal documents. If these signatures are his, they reveal that he had difficulty signing his own name. Some experts doubt that even these signatures are his and think they were done by law clerks. Shakespeare grew up in an illiterate household. Both of his parents witnessed documents with a mark, and neither of his daughters could write. He may have attended the Stratford Grammar School, but the records no longer survive. Nothing shows that he ever attended any university. Scholars know nothing about how he acquired the vast knowledge displayed in the works. Not that he couldn't have done it somehow, but how could he have done it without leaving a single trace? Stratfordians attribute the feat to his innate genius, but even a genius must acquire knowledge. No book that he owned or that is known to have been in his possession has ever been found. No record shows that Shakespeare, the author, ever received payment or secured patronage for writing. After dedicating his first 2 poems to the Earl of Southampton, he wrote no more dedications. Why would any writer motivated by profit, as we are told Shakespeare was, not seek patronage? Stratfordians say the Earl of Southampton was his patron, but no record shows that they ever met. Contrary to the common assumption that the author was a prominent public figure, No record shows that he ever addressed the public directly, either in person or in writing. And no record shows that either Elizabeth I or James I ever met Shakespeare or spoke or wrote his name. Not that there are no documents for Shakespeare. There are over 70, but all are non-literary. They show a Stratford businessman and a theater entrepreneur and part-time actor in London. How is it all of these records survived, but all of those relating to his literary career are lost? Stranger still, this alleged prolific writer retired in his late 40s with his faculties intact to return to the same village from which he came, never to write a play, a poem, or even a letter. No record shows that he ever put on a play in Stratford or that any resident viewed him as a poet. Several people who knew him or who he was did not seem to associate him with the author. Scholars have found few, mostly weak connections between Shakespeare's life and the works. Why are nearly all the plays set among the nobility, portraying them as if he were an insider? Why are so many in Italy? And how is it that even obscure details in these plays are accurate? Why did he never mention Stratford or write a play that seems to reflect his own background? His detailed will, in which he famously left his wife my second best bed with the furniture, contains no Shakespearean turn of phrase and mentions no books, plays, poems, or literary effects of any kind. There are no musical instruments, despite the author's musical expertise. He mentions no writing materials or furniture, artworks, or intellectual property of any kind. He left money for rings to 3 fellow actors, but nothing to any writers or to his alleged patron. Shakespeare's will is the one document that we know for sure is the product of his mind, and it is damning to his authorship claim. It is not the will of the same person who wrote the works. Toward the end of the declaration, we quote Hugh Trevor Roper, Regius Professor of History at Oxford University. Regius Professor meaning he was appointed by the monarch. And Roper was also, you should know, the British intelligence officer assigned to track Hitler during World War II. While he was a history professor at Oxford, he turned his attention to Shakespeare, and he wrote that he found Shakespeare's elusiveness exasperating and almost incredible. After all, he lived in the full daylight of the English Renaissance, in the well-documented reigns of Queen Elizabeth and King James I, and since his death has been subjected to the greatest battery of organized research ever directed upon a single person. And yet the greatest of all Englishmen, after this tremendous inquisition, still remains so close to a mystery that even his identity can still be doubted. There is a lot more in the Declaration, but I'll leave it there and you can read it for yourselves. It's 3,000 words and can be read and signed in 30 minutes at our website at doubtaboutwill.org. What do Stratfordians say about the Declaration? Mostly they say as little as possible because they know it is all true. A noted exception is Professor James Shapiro at Columbia University, who wrote admiringly of it in his authorship book, Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare? No one has written a rebuttal telling us where we are wrong or written a counter declaration. Again, the declaration can be read and signed at the SAC's website at doubtaboutwill.org. Bob?
Thanks very much. That was a terrific presentation, as always. All right, I would like to give you now a crash course in the resources, some of the resources available to you as you pursue the subject of Oxfordian authorship. So the first book I'm going to mention is Shakespeare Identified. This new edition was edited by Jim Warren, who is quite the scholar. And it's very well annotated, brought up to date, and it can form, if you haven't read it and don't have it, it can form the basis of your Oxfordian library. Jim doesn't need a hobby. He has all of this. He's got Shakespeare Revealed, which is the collected articles and published letters of J. Thomas Loney. And I got to tell you, going through it in a consistent basis is just fascinating. Shakespeare revolutionized the first 100 years of Loney's work and the impact of Loney's work, also edited by Jim, is a remarkable collection of material. And finally, we have Shakespeare Investigated, which was the earliest work that looked at the responses, positive and often very negative, to Loney's theory and the Shakespeare Fellowship. So I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Bob, that's all very nice, but that's history. I need a contemporary biography. Well, if I got a book for you, I got to figure this out here. Shakespeare by Another Name by Mark Anderson, get his name there, is a wonderful biography written a few years ago. And it really sets the scene and gives you the cultural connections to Shakespeare, to Oxford. But now you're saying, okay, that's all very nice. Now I got the biography. I want to dig a little bit more deeply into the plays. This is only one of a series of books that both exist and are planned that will analyze the plays and poems from an Oxfordian perspective. This one has been edited by Richard Whalen. And I'm giving a presentation in middle of Virginia in about 3 weeks, and I've been thumbing through it. This is a book that takes a look at The Tempest. It was written by Roger Strittmatter and Lynn Kosisky, and it takes a look at false information that has been parlayed to make it seem as if Oxford could not have written The Tempest. He did, and the book explains and demolishes that sense of false information. Another work by Strittmatter is the poems. It's one of a series, Poems of Edward de Vere, in which Professor Strittmatter analyzes each of the poems. And it's terrific. All right, you want to know, I hear you, you want to know about Shakespeare and Italy. How did he know so much? This is an interesting book. It was mentioned in Tom's talk. Richard Paul Rowe was an attorney living in Pasadena, and every summer he went to Italy and simply researched each of the plays. And his research is just remarkable. It made my wife an Oxfordian, and it's terrific. But now you're saying you want something shorter. You want tidbits, or at least shorter bites. Hank Whittemore has written a terrific, terrific book, 100 Reasons Shakespeare Was the Earl of Oxford. Many of you will understand what the graphic here is, a hand coming out from behind a curtain. But you just go anywhere, or you have a question and you want to know about the depth of dedications, or you want to know about a public letter for Cardenas Comfort, or Oxford the writer. It's all there. Essays by one of our leading Oxfordians, Bonner Miller Cutting, excuse me. These essays deal with the first folio. Why is it missing from Lady Anne's bed shelf? The bookshelf. Who knows what was on her bed shelf? It was the question of Oxford's £1,000 annuity, which is significant because it came at a time when he needed the money, and oh, by the way, was writing history plays that supported the monarchy. You want to know about Shakespeare Suppressed by Catherine Children. This goes over, provides a great deal of information about, as it says, the uncensored truth about Shakespeare and his work. Very detailed. I urge you to read Shakespeare Beyond Doubt with the question mark that Tom was talking about, because you can find, as I did, at least one reference in here where someone's writing about Shakespeare's education and says Shakespeare, comma, whoever he was. That's from a Stratfordian. You want to know about how early were the earliest Shakespeare doubts, the doubts about Shakespeare's authorship. They were very early. I'm going to get this for you exactly. Take my word for it. There were about 30 doubts expressed in the late 16th century about authorship. They were published, and contemporary authors have ignored them. You want to know about what membership in the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship gets you? Well, here's Oxfordian 23, a peer-reviewed publication. Tom was talking about, and so was John, the signatures. There's a significant article in here that basically says that the signatures were probably written by law clerks because our boy couldn't write. There's a newsletter that comes out 4 times a year for members. And there is the Shakespeare Authorship source book, which is going through a new edition, will be out soon, especially for teachers who want to both encourage skepticism, but also want to encourage their students to think and to write. Now, I am, through the magic of computers here, going to seek to share my screen so I can go over some websites with you. So hang on for this perilous ride. And here we are, amazingly. So this is the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. I'm not going to dip into each section, but you can see that it's quite full. Video contest, skeptics, authorship videos, podcasts. I'll get to that in a second. We have news, we have publications, and what's significant here, if you're interested in research, is that the publications go back many years. They have been not brought up to speed, but they have been incorporated in here, have been digitized. That was the word I was looking for. So you can do your historical studies. This tells you more about us. Speakers Bureau is very interesting, depending upon where you live anywhere in the United States and overseas. The organization can provide you with a speaker for your school or social club. Press, you can always donate. After all, we wouldn't be a nonprofit if we didn't ask. And there's a search button here. Scrolling down, the page will give you more information. And one of the things it will tell you about is Don't Quill the Messenger, which is a podcast that comes out once every 2 weeks on the various podcast platforms. Stephen Sable, a member of the group, interviews various people. Podcasts are usually about an hour or so long. Let me see, I'm going to move down here. It is impossible in the modern world to ignore YouTube, and the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship has a YouTube channel with many videos that are produced or were produced at conferences when we were all meeting together. You can learn a great deal and see many of the people whom you've heard about and will read about. The De Vere Society in England has a terrific website, very well organized. And I encourage you, if you are interested in the subject or in any aspect of the subject, to take a look at it. Facebook is another platform for information. This is the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship's basic website, which deals with events that will take place. And this is Shakespeare, which is another website that deals with the subject. And also it has very, very interesting and sometimes rather intense discussions about issues. There are other platforms that you can use. There are films that you can investigate. There's Anonymous a number of years ago, a full-length feature. There is Cheryl Egan Donovan's video called Nothing is Truer Than Truth. There is Robin Phillips' upcoming video, Shakespeare Truth Behind the Name. And so before we sign off, oh, there's one thing I wanted to mention, a number of you commented on. We had expected to have a video by Keir Cutler. We had some technical problems with it. It's available both on YouTube and I believe through our website. A lot of you have been using the chat. Let me ask you if you have any questions for John, Shahan, or myself. We can answer. A lot of questions that have nothing to do with me, which is probably terrific. I'm told that Nothing is Truer Than Truth is a feature-length documentary film available on Amazon. And if you haven't seen it, go see it. It's absolutely terrific. So the website is shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. Before you leave, I want to remind you that we will resume tomorrow at noon Eastern US time, 12 noon Eastern time. Having said that, unless someone has other comments, I will say thanks a lot for being with us, and we will see you tomorrow.